Welcome to Studio 118, where we discuss big questions and we try to break it down for you so you can grow in your faith and have some really fruitful conversations with your friends and family and neighbors. So we're coming live to you from Calvary South Austin. We're live on YouTube. We got some people in person in the church, which is great to see. And we're also streaming to Austin Cable Access Channel 11. So if you're watching us from Channel 11, we welcome you. Thank you for tuning in. We hope to enlighten you and just give you a good discussion. Today we're talking about a big question, big topic of morality. Where does it come from, and what is the best explanation of where morality comes from? So like I said, we're Studio 118 and coming to you live on YouTube. Also, we have a Q&A after our discussion, as we do every time we do one of these episodes. So stay tuned for that. But also, we have our live chat going on YouTube. So feel free to chat in there. But also, more importantly, I want you to send in your questions. If you have any questions regarding morality, any trip-ups that you may have and you want some clarification, we hope to answer that for you. So make sure to send in your questions on the YouTube live chat, or you can also send them in if you want to email them to outreach@calvarysouthAustin.com. That's outreach@calvarysouthAustin.com. I also want to remind you to share the link, this live stream link, with others on your social media platforms. That way a lot more people can join in on the conversation and hear a good discussion. And specific to Calvary South Austin, I want to remind you guys that we have opened the doors to our church. Texas has begun opening up, and we have opened our doors now for the last few weeks. So we invite you to come join us. We've taken all the necessary measures to keep everybody safe and distant, and we want to welcome you guys and just make sure that you feel comfortable here. But we also want to do face-to-face fellowship. So this Sunday, we invite you to come on by 9:15 and 11:15 a.m. Those are our two services. And this Sunday, our Pastor Bunjee, to my left, he's going to be teaching on surviving the storm. So come on by, guys. And for those of you who are still in the at-risk category, we do live stream our second service, so that's at 11:15 a.m., so that's available for you. Well, with all those announcements out of the way, guys, I want to introduce, again, our discussion. We're talking about morality, but I do want to introduce our other speaker here. And you've seen him before. He's our pastor here at Calvary South Austin.
Pastor at large.
Pastor at large. Yes, he's everything at large. And Pastor Bunjee Garrett. Give some virtual claps from him. And welcome, Bunjee.
It's good to be here. It's good to be here. So you introduced the name Studio 118.
Studio 118, I did.
118.
Yes, 118.
118?
118?
Why 118?
Yeah, why 118? That's a good question. So Studio 118, it comes from a scripture reference, Isaiah 118, where God is speaking to his people, and he says, "Come now, let us reason together." And this is what this discussion platform is all about, guys, is, again, taking those big topics, and we want to make sure that we understand what we believe about Christianity, about the Bible, about God, and why we believe it. We want to have reasonable discussions. We want to be able to grow in our faith. We want to understand why it is we believe what we believe, because we do believe that there are great reasonable answers and evidence to show that Christianity is true, and we want to share a lot of those reasons with you guys. So Studio 118 comes from Isaiah 1:18.
Look it up.
Now, let us reason. Yeah. All right, so let's dive right into it, Bunjee. So we're talking about morality, where it comes from, but we want to lay the issue out, lay the foundation. And first we're going to talk about, well, what is morality? That's a kind of a fancy term, maybe. We like to use the word, but maybe a lot of us might not exactly know what exactly we're talking about. So let's lay the foundation. Let's define morality.
Well, so morality has to do with, right and wrong.
Yep.
Good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And just to make a distinction between those two, because it could be easy for us to think that right and wrong and good and bad are the same things. And they're not exactly. There is some nuance here. Moral values point to what is good and what is bad, and moral duties point to what is right and what is wrong, or what we might call as oughtness. Mm-hmm. The concept of oughtness is there's a thing that you ought do, and there's things that you ought not do. So when people make, the sort of arguments of, well, that person shouldn't have done that. That officer shouldn't have, pinned that man down. That criminal shouldn't have looted that building. All of these are moral statements that speak of oughtness. That we ought not, loot. We ought not, murder. We ought not, engage in criminal activity. Right. So, so there is that. All of these statements have to do with morality. Right. So morality has to do with our moral values in defining what is good, what is bad, and our moral duties or obligations, what is right and what is wrong, and how should we live, in other words.
Yeah. So there are values and duties. I'm glad you brought up that distinction, because I think, just even in our everyday lives, right, we make a lot of moral judgments. And I think that's something that maybe might we might just take that in passing. We don't realize how many moral judgments we make on a daily basis.
Sure.
Right? And so this is going to be, I think that's why I love this topic. It's one of my favorites, but because we use it every day, but not a lot of us really take the time to stop and think about, why am I talking like that? And what justification do I have, right? If I'm a Christian, is there a good justification? Or if I'm an atheist or what other kind of worldview, what justification do I have to use these terms like should, ought not, should not, that kind of stuff?
Yeah,
right?
and then, then comes the question, of, what moral obligations do I expect of others? And what, moral obligations do I expect of myself? Oftentimes it's not the same. People tend to expect more out of the people around them than they expect of themselves, morally speaking. We tend to overlook our own moral failures while expecting others, to maintain, perfection when it comes to, good and bad and right and wrong. For example, there's a lot of people who really don't have a problem with their own thievery.
Yeah.
Right. They might not feel like they did anything wrong when they took money from somebody else or took an item from their neighbor or something to that. But if you take something from them, they're going to be the first person to say, oh, you did something wrong. You stole from me, And so we have to consider, when it comes to the topic of morality, that, sometimes, we don't think that there's a moral issue when we're guilty of it. But the minute it happens to us, we cry foul, which really reveals what we truly believe about morality.
Yeah, it's like, I guess I've heard it put, kind of, I'm paraphrasing at this point, but, sins or flaws look worse on other people rather than ourselves, right?
Yeah, my sins look worse on you.
Pretty sure they do.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
So if we're both guilty of the same sins, I tend to overlook those sins when I do them. But when you do them to me, I'm going to, call you out on it and say, oh, that's immoral behavior. How dare you?
Yeah. When
in reality, I'm guilty too.
I wish people would approach me just like, hey, that's immoral behavior.
That's immoral behavior.
I don't like that. So that's a good example of just the practical outworking of morality, right? And just to let you audience out there on the internet know, ultimately, with this discussion, we want to aim at arriving at an answer about where does morality ultimately come from, all right? We're Christians, obviously. We believe morality stems from God, God's nature, and we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be explaining that, give good reasons for that. But there are other questions. There are other explanations or attempted explanations at finding out where does morality stem from? Where does it come from? What is the source of morality? And so that's our ultimate question that we want to explain to you guys and help you guys understand. And we can have a good discussion. And hopefully you guys have some good questions for us waiting for on the back end. But these are three of the different explanations that we're going to discuss today. These are different explanations that have been offered. Number one is morality comes from our parents or our community. All right, number one is morality comes from our parents. I just got them from my parents or from my community surrounding me. The second explanation that's been offered is morality is a trait that has evolved in humans. So evolution now comes into play. That's another explanation that's been tossed about, dealing with evolution and how morality comes from that whole process. And we'll talk about that. And then lastly, we're going to consider the one that we land on. It's morality is grounded in God and stems from God's nature. All right? So let's jump right into it. About morality, just a little bit more about morality and the nature of morality. There's a couple things that we notice about morality, and I think that'll help us set the stage for essentially if you're going to give a good explanation about where morality comes from, you have to account for these things about morality. Number one, you already mentioned it, about universality. When you mentioned the example of, when I make moral judgments, I expect others around me to abide by those same values and duties, right? Universality. Is there anything you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I just think that, that's a good problem for people to wrestle with, because why do we expect others to abide by the moral laws that we have embraced? So I might embrace a code of conduct that defines my morality, and I might apply that to myself, but what gives me the right to then apply it to everybody else? Right? Like, I might think that racism is wrong, but do I have a basis for expecting everyone else to think that racism is wrong?
Right.
Right? And if we should all think that racism is wrong, then the only way that could be true is if morality is universally true. And at that point in time, it's no longer subjective but objective. You want to explain that, or do you want me to do that?
Yeah, subjective, objective, these great words that get tossed around, especially in morality, right? So subjective, when you're talking about subjective morality, we're talking about morality that derives from the subject, meaning the individual person. So when a person says, well, usually it comes in when the person says something like, well, that's my morality and you have your morality. They're trying to implement subjective morality at that point. They're basically saying, I have my moral code of conduct, my moral values and duties, and I'm not going to try to impose them on anybody. In fact, everybody else's can be different, but as long as we just kind of stay kosher with one another.
6 feet apart?
6 feet apart, you would say that's a safe distance for morality. Then we're good. But ultimately, they're saying that morality comes from them. They're the ultimate arbiters of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. It comes from the subject. Now, compare that and contrast that to objective morality. And objective says that there are actually good, bad things or right and wrong things that are totally independent from the individuals. It stands outside of the individuals as its own thing, as its own reference point. So no matter what anybody says about a certain situation or certain moral value or duty, it's not going to change if it's actually right or wrong, good or bad. So the individual can't change the rightness or wrongness of things because it's objectively right or wrong or good or bad. So subjective, it stems from me. Objective, it's outside of me, and it's independent. Okay, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and then so we can take that and back into universality again, right? So if morality is subjective and it's just my creation, if you will,
sure,
my invention, I can try to convince a bunch of other people to agree with me so that my invention becomes a convention, right? So that we have, maybe a mob or a mass that we all agree that morality, the code of conduct that we ought to live by, is spelled out in this way. Like, we can try to convince enough people to get on board with my subjective definition of morality. But you can still, find maybe a culture, on the other side of the world that just has a completely different set of moral values and duties that are in complete conflict, with our own. Would we have a right to try to convince them to think the same way we think about morality, right? So if morality is subjective, the problem is that you can't expect anyone else to agree with you. And so all you can do is try to maintain your own code of conduct. Yeah. But you can't impose that on anybody else unless they disagree and have a social contract that's the way they're that we're going to form our society, right? If on the other hand, morality is universal, it's just true regardless of who agrees with it and who doesn't, right? So if morality is universal, then it doesn't matter that, most people under the Third Reich, believed that gassing Jews was okay.
Well, we're going there already.
It was wrong.
Yep.
It was if morality is universal, and there are things that are universally true about morality, doesn't matter how many people disagree with it.
Yep.
The whole world could disagree with it. Doesn't make it false, though, right? Why? Because a universal truth is outside or beyond the opinion of men. So then that brings us to the question of, is morality universal and therefore binding on every person wherever you are? Or is it subjective and we just get to define our code of conduct as we go?
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up because, we were chatting a little bit before this discussion, and, you brought up how throughout history, right, and throughout the entire globe, it seems that we have shared these, at least some fundamental universal moral values about life specifically, right? Even if they implement it in inconsistent ways, they still share this underlying value that life or certain kinds of life are sacred and others are not, right?
You bet.
So there seems to be at least one universal moral value about life being sacred or precious, right?
Sure. Well, so with the Nazis, the philosophy was that the Jews were subhuman, and therefore exterminating them was not the murder of individuals or humans, but rather ridding the gene pool of these subhumans who they believed were keeping us from experiencing true evolution and becoming the supermen, right? Same with the abortion issue, right? When it comes down to the abortion argument, those who are pro-life believe that life begins at conception, right? Well, the people who are pro-choice don't then turn around and say, yes, you're right, life begins at conception, but we're going to abort babies anyway. No. They make the argument, no, there's not actual life until birth, right? And there's different forms of that argument. But those who, believe in the pro-choice position don't believe that they're killing life.
Right.
They would find that concept morally reprehensible, right? What they do is, say, no, this is not a life yet until birth, right? And so even in that, they are attempting to justify their position with a moral argument, agreeing that it's wrong to take a life. But we're not doing that. This is not a life, right?
Yeah.
Now, I disagree with that. I think that life begins at conception. I think the science bears that out.
Yep.
But again, I'm just making the point that even the pro-choice abortionist attempts to maintain morality by identifying, the fetus in the womb as not viable and therefore
or not a person, not a human,
not truly living, or not a life.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting little side point here is that, with subjective morality, we have to understand, internet audience, ideas have consequences. And that's why this subject of morality is such an important one. Because when we are forced to confront this issue head on and figure out where does morality come from, what makes the best explanation for the source of morality, moral values and duties, ideas have consequences. And so if you're in the subjective realm, you quickly go down this spiraling maze of just inconsistencies, it seems, and we'll bear some of these out, but Bunjee's already talked about a couple of them. Historically speaking, when you start viewing others as subhuman, and that fits in line with your supposed moral values, then ideas have consequences. People start getting exterminated. Not only the unborn, but as historically speaking, you saw in the Third Reich, where you had concentration camps and people just being exterminated completely. So that's why this discussion here is an important one. But now, so going back to the issue at hand, so we're talking about there's things about morality, there's characteristics about moral values and duties that every explanation has to account for. So we talked about universality. It seems that there are at least fundamental moral truths that everybody shares and everybody just assumes that everybody else shares. So that's very interesting. Every explanation, if you're going to give a good explanation, it has to account for universality of moral values. Not only that, but it has to be objective. it seems that when we speak in moral terms, when we make moral judgments, we're saying that it's objectively wrong or objectively good, certain situations. That's just the way we speak. We assume objectivity of moral values. And then the last one that we just can touch on real quick is just how moral values seem to be immaterial. And this really strikes against atheism and naturalism, right?
You bet. And subjectivity.
Yep.
Because if morality is just based in the chemical reactions of the brain, then again, we shouldn't expect it to be universal in nature, right? If our morality is just chemical reactions, neurons, and just my brain functioning, then we should expect that my code of conduct, my moral values, and my moral duties are different from yours, because the chemical reactions in your brain are different from the chemical reactions in my brain, and so therefore we shouldn't have the exact same code of conduct, right? But because morality does appear to have a universal foundation that anywhere you go, the society is going to say it's wrong to abuse kids. Anywhere you go, murder is going to be wrong. Anywhere you go, thievery, stealing is going to be wrong. There is a universality to morality. So therefore, it can't just be, based in chemical reactions, right? So in the world of atheism, everything is just matter in motion.
Yeah.
And it can't account for immaterial laws like the laws of morality. It can't account for immaterial laws like the laws of logic. So because we do see this universal nature to the laws of morality, they have to be immaterial then. They can't just be part of the material makeup of the brain.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly what we're getting at, guys, is, again, the immateriality, if that's a word, if I can use that, immaterialness, I don't know.
It's not a word, you can use it though.
Yes. Immaterial nature of moral values and universality and objectivity of moral values. If you're going to give an explanation, if you're going to put forth an explanation of where moral values come from, it has to account for these three things. So let's jump into that first explanation that's been given, which is morality ultimately comes from my parents or my community. So I've heard this before. When we go out, before COVID and all that, it seems so long ago, but we used to go out to UT campus and have good discussions with the students there.
Ah, the good old days.
The good old days. Oh, coming soon, hopefully. So I've heard this before from students there at the UT campus when you ask them, so explain to me, where do you get your morals? Where does morality come from? You say, well, my parents, showed me how to live when I was growing up, right? So that's kind of a summary view, is that essentially as you develop from an infant to a toddler to an adolescent to an adult, your parents are passing down their moral values to you by teaching you explicitly, or they just by the way they act it out in their lives, right? And supposedly this is an explanation of where morality ultimately comes from. Well, let's talk about this. Are there pitfalls? Are there pros, cons here?
You bet. Because imagine the parent who raises their child to steal, and they're grifters, and so they've raised their kid to sneak into, places and just steal stuff, right? That would mean that this is good, morally right for this child, because that's what their parent taught them. What about the Hitler Youth organization, right? So, during Nazi Germany, you have the Third Reich, taking kids from their parents, housing them, and, training them to become, good Nazis who, hate the Jews and, are going to carry on this legacy of genocide. And if morality is based on, what somebody is taught in their community, then that would mean the kids who were, taught to hate Jews, that would be good for them. That would be morally correct, because that's what their community taught them, right? The people who, grew up, in early America watching slavery, and the slave-owning parent, who was teaching their child that owning slaves is good, that would be morally good for them, right? Because that's what parents taught them. Now, I'm sure we all recognize that this is all wrong.
Right.
that just because a child is taught to hate Jews doesn't mean it's good, morally good, to hate Jews, or the child who was raised, in a racist society that was taught to believe that slavery is good doesn't make it good, right? So therefore, morality isn't defined by parents. It's not defined by a community. If it is, then we just have to say, to Nazi Germany, go for it. You have your morality, we have ours. Go ahead and, continue gassing the Jews as much as you like, because that's your morality, because that's what your parents taught you.
Yeah.
Nobody says that. No, we invaded, we took control, we, stopped, the the enemy.
Yep.
And saved a bunch of Jews, right? That was good. But how do I know that? Just because my parents taught me that, we ought to stop, Nazis? Does that make it right? Well, no. Because just because my parents taught me to fight against, racism, and taught me to fight against Nazis, and taught me to fight against, these sorts of things, that doesn't mean that they were right either, right?
Right.
So then, morality can't just be grounded in parental instruction or the community convention that, we just all agree that this is the right way to be.
Yeah, this is where, right at the outset, when the person is responding and saying, well, morality comes from my parents or community, it's blatantly subjective. They're essentially saying, well, morality just comes from another individual, and I just so happen to be raised by that individual, and I just accepted their moral values wholesale, right? I didn't have a choice. I was a kid, and that's the way I just grew up, and I just adopted those moral values. So it's blatantly subjective. So on the three accounts that must be accounted for morality, it already fails on, I would say, the most important one, which is subjectivity versus objectivity. This explanation here is blatantly subjective, and so it fails to account for the objective nature of moral values. So just like Bunjee laid out, imagine, just a thought experiment, your neighbor who is raised by parents with radically different moral values, like if they're a grifter, they're just taught to steal and do immoral things, what you consider immoral things, because you believe that morals come from parents or a community, you can't objectively say if they're right or wrong or doing good or bad things. You can just say, well, that's just the way they choose to live, and hopefully they don't come to my door because I don't know who's going to win at that point, right? It's that old adage of might makes right. That's essentially what this worldview is adopting, is subjective morality, and that's where it's going to get you in trouble, because historically speaking, when the poor and the needy among us, the most vulnerable, when they're having their rights violated, there's a lot of people that want to stand up, but for the subjective moralist, it becomes incredibly difficult. I mean, I would say it's impossible to stand up for that person. You would have to go against your own philosophy to stand up for the vulnerable.
Yep.
And so that's my main issue. And it's interesting to me, because I've heard this response from plenty of people at the UT campus, plenty of those students, and to me, I see it in the end, it just kicks the can down the road. It doesn't really answer the question about where morality ultimately comes from. They're just saying where they adopted it. That's a distinction that I want to make there. So hopefully, Christian, if you're listening on the internet and you're looking to have a good conversation, or you've already heard a person kind of adopt this worldview, I want you to understand that distinction. They're not answering where morality ultimately comes from. They're just answering and responding where they got their morality. Okay, so I hope that distinction makes sense. We're trying to answer the ultimate question: where do moral values and duties ultimately come from? Okay. And right here, I did have for the internet audience some good questions to ask. So if a person responds in this way, I would encourage you, ask this question: well, where did your parents get their morality from? And you would see that this is a little bit of a game you can play, and you could just basically keep asking that question until you hopefully get to the very beginning, and then hopefully that'll light a little light bulb above their head and say, oh, you're trying to ask, where do morals ultimately come from? So if you could play that little game and just keep asking that question until you get to the very beginning.
And then, if I can just throw in there also that this gives way to moral relativism. right? Because, if my code of conduct, if my moral law was defined by my parents, well, what's to stop me from just redefining morality, right? Once I'm an adult,
Yep.
and I can think for myself, why do I have to maintain the moral code that my parents passed to me? Why can't I rethink it and just look around and say, well, it's a brave new world, and we're looking for a new normal, and so we're going to have a whole different set of moral values and duties, and I'm going to define this for my family just as my parents did for me, and I can just redefine it however I want, right? And so if morality is defined by family or community, it gives way to moral relativism, because why do I have to embrace the morality of my community? Why do I have to embrace the morality? Why am I morally obligated to maintain their morals?
Yeah.
If it's all subjective.
And to maybe tread in a little bit controversial water here, but we have seen these play out. Specifically, last year we saw a slew of mass shootings, right? Where you see the acts of those young people generally, and then they always pan over to the parents and they interview them and say, we had no idea. I thought we were raising them in a good environment. And typically, they probably have overall good upbringings, I think, but they decided to take matters into their own hands, right?
Yeah.
So you see that's where, again, ideas have consequences. Once you get into that subjective realm of morality and it leads to relativism, then really anything
goes.
Anything goes, logically speaking, anything goes. So on that front, this explanation that morality, moral values come from my parents or from a community, it fails on that most important aspect of being subjective. And therefore, we don't believe it is a good explanation at all to answer the question, where do morals come from? Well, that's our first point, guys. I just want to stop here quickly and remind you guys, number one, welcome again to Studio 118, where we discuss big questions, we break it down for you, and hopefully you guys can have fruitful conversations as a result. We're coming to you live from Calvary, South Austin. We're opening the doors here. We got people here with us, an audience. We're also streaming live on YouTube. You can visit our channel, youtube.com/Calvary South Austin. Also, we're also streaming live on Austin Cable Access Channel 11. So if you're joining us on Channel 11, we welcome you. Hopefully you're enjoying the discussion so far. And for those of you streaming live on YouTube, we encourage you to share that link with others, even subscribe to our channel, hit that little notification bell, but share this link with others so they can join in on the discussion as well. And don't forget that we'll have a Q&A session after our discussion. So send in your questions on that live chat, or if you want to email them, you can send them to outreach@calvarysouthaustin.com. Again, that's outreach@calvarysouthaustin.com. All right, well, let's jump back into it, Bunjee. So our second explanation that's been offered here is, let's jump into this one. It's morality is a trait that has evolved in humans. Morality is a trait that has evolved in humans. So we're talking about evolution here and how it leads to apparently moral values. What do you think about that?
Well, I disagree.
Okay.
I just disagree. So again, this would bring us right back to it came from parents then, right? So it just kind of loops back on itself. So if we are highly evolved animals, and then along the way, Neanderthal decided that, hey, our community would be better if we stopped killing one another, and so let's just agree that homicide is wrong, and so on and so forth, right?
Let's all agree.
Let's all agree, right? Yeah. Let's have a social contract, based on this moral convention that we're not going to kill each other anymore, and those who do kill each other, we're going to hold them accountable, right? Well, that doesn't mean that everyone has to agree with this or abide by it, and it just becomes a mob rules mentality, right? And what about those who are all for thinning the herd, so to speak, right? Why not introduce viruses that might take out a third of the population just because we're getting overpopulated? What's wrong with that argument?
You talking about Thanos?
Yeah, talking about Thanos.
Okay.
Just a little snap of the But what's wrong with that? So if evolution is true, then so is the concept of the strong will survive, or survival of the fittest. Well, why wouldn't we then employ a morality that's based in that, right? Why wouldn't we employ a morality that lines up with survival of the fittest? So that if there is a baby born that needs incubation or needs some sort of life support to survive, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we just say, well, if they don't make it, they don't make it, strong will survive? Why would we allow the gene pool to be corrupted? This kind of gave way to Hitler's whole point of view on exterminating the Jews. His belief was that the blonde-haired, blue-eyed superhuman, is the highest form of evolution, and those who, when you look back at Darwin's point of view, it was very racist. Darwin's point of view was, basically that, the people of color were closer to what we have evolved from, which is just completely scientifically false. But based on this concept of Darwinism, that the people of color, are the least evolved, and the blonde-haired, blue-eyed individual is the most evolved, then his goal was to start exterminating, the Jews who he considered to be subhuman, so that he could free the gene pool of this corruption, so that we could go on to become Nietzsche's Superman, and have an Aryan race of, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, right? That would make sense if evolution was true, right? If evolution is true, then, that bears out. So why do we say, oh, no, we want to make handicap ramps for the handicapped, rather than let's get rid of the handicapped people because they're not as strong as, right? So why, would we, if evolution is true, have the sort of morality that we do have now? Or we take care of the weak, where we, take care of those who can't take care of themselves.
We have altruistic acts, people throwing themselves in harm's way to save others. That kind of stuff is just goes against evolutionary ways of thinking, the selfish gene and whatnot.
And then when you look at the animal kingdom, which according to evolution we've come from and are still part of, because let's be honest, if evolution is true, then we're just animals that communicate differently.
We're just a different branch on the tree, right?
So if that's the case, if we are evolved animals, well, look back to our ancestors. Look back to the animal kingdom, and if the cat murders the mouse, it's not murder. It's just survival. If the dog attacks the cat, cats don't get together and form a coalition against all speciesism, the dogs that are engaging in speciesism, it's just like that doesn't happen, right? So if we've evolved, and therefore morality is the product of evolution, I would assume that morality would be very different than what it is right now.
Oh, most definitely.
I would believe that our morality would be based on survival of the fittest rather than on taking care of the weakest.
And I understand on a certain level, I understand when a person brings up this objection or they bring up this explanation, because it seems to, you can kind of carry it a little bit of the way, because that same person would more than likely say, well, just look at the world and how they exhibit morality, how they actually act it out, and everything's just so wildly different, right? You would expect that on evolution. Everybody's going to be implementing their own moral values in inconsistent ways. And so that's kind of like another explanation of what you would expect from evolution. But to me, that really doesn't get you the whole way, because as the stuff that you brought up, morality would look completely different if evolution is actually true. Even taking it a little bit further, we wouldn't even be aware that there is such a thing as morality. We would just be acting it out. Okay, so you're not aware of it, but let's say, for argument's sake, you are aware of morality and you're able to form your own moral judgments, then Bunjee's right, where you have the survival of the fittest, and I'm just here to propagate my DNA to the next generation, then I'm going to do whatever that takes, whether it's stomping over the little old lady crossing the street, and I got to do what I got to do in order to propagate my species. There really is there's no good, there's no evil. You can't even use those terms. If you do use those terms, they're really just meaningless. I did have a quote I wanted to share. This is from a evolutionary biologist, famous guy, Richard Dawkins, considered one of the four horsemen of atheism, wrote a book called The God Delusion way back in the early 2000s. And this was a quote of his in another book he wrote called River Out of Eden. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now that is a grand admission of exactly where evolution, if it's true, where it leads. No good.
There is no rhyme or reason in that.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that Richard Dawkins, this is the same person, right? Atheist, hardcore atheist, probably anti-theist. When he says there is at bottom no good, no evil, this is the same person who will, with the next breath, speak out against
God,
making moral judgments about God and about his followers.
Oh yeah.
So there's inconsistency there, and I say you can't live it out consistently.
Nope.
You can't live it out consistently.
No, and when you look back to the animal kingdom, you'll see, the gorilla that goes and wipes out, the offspring of the other gorilla so that it can force itself and propagate its own so would we call that rape?
Right.
If the gorilla comes in, defeats the other gorilla, kills off that gorilla's children, and then forces itself onto this female so that it can bear its own children, is that rape? We would call that rape and murder. But the animal kingdom,
they get a special pass.
They don't see it that way. There wasn't anything morally wrong with any of that.
Yeah.
It's just the strong survive, right?
Yeah, another I guess inconsistency that I've noticed, typically the people that would ascribe to evolutionary thinking or an explanation based on evolution is that these are also the same persons who will bring up the explanation that we should look to the animal kingdom for certain guidance as to how to live our lives, specifically like homosexuality, right? We see it in the animal kingdom, therefore it's okay.
Right.
Or rather, it's more than okay, it's good. It's good that should be pursued in our lives as highly evolved animals. But yet, if you bring up an example like this, well, let's carry it even a step further. Should we do all the other things that the animal kingdom is doing?
Right.
And I'm sure they would say, well, no, that's different because they're actively harming, right? They're already ascribing harm to be something bad. And so this is where, again, they're assuming bad, they're assuming moral values already in trying to explain where morality comes from.
Right.
That's what gets me, is that they're just kicking that can down the road again. They're not getting to the ultimate question about where morality comes from. They're just really responding to, well, how do I come to know morality? Evolution, and maybe I picked up a few things along the way, and I'm free to choose, right? Moral relativism. I'm free to choose and pick and choose whatever I want from the moral buffet.
I have no doubt that Richard Dawkins has a code of conduct and that he believes in moral values and duties. I have no doubt that he expects others to also live up to his concept of a moral code, right? He just doesn't have anything to ground it to. He doesn't have anything that he can say, this is the basis for why it's the right code of conduct. Because in an atheistic universe, all you're left with is matter in motion. All he has are his chemical reactions that lead him to think. As much as like he will argue about the God gene, that makes people believe in God, right? And, well,
because of virus. Yeah.
Is there a moral gene that makes you think that it's good to take care of the weak? Because you didn't get that from the animal kingdom. You didn't get that from evolution.
Yeah.
It's just maybe some sort of defective gene in you that makes you want to, do good for others, right? It's certainly not something that you see, by and large in the animal kingdom. So, when I consider someone like a Richard Dawkins or the other atheists, no doubt that they try to be moral, upstanding people, right? I would never make the argument that atheists are immoral or attempt to be immoral people. I think that, I've met lots of atheists, and many of whom, are outstanding people.
Mm-hmm.
But, where does their morality come from? If everything is just matter and motion, then it's just the chemical reactions of their brain, or it's just a convention of men. But it's certainly not universal or binding to every person everywhere.
Yeah, that's another interesting point. This point I think is probably one of the worst ones, but one of the explanations that a lot of people hold to. So that's why we're spending a little bit extra time on it. But you reminded me of something where if evolution is true and we're all just born with whatever mutations we have, and that's where we get our moral code from, then that removes moral culpability. That removes any responsibility that we have. So,
sure.
Not to get too dark, but like if a person is born with predisposition to be a pedophile or some other worse kind of things that we think are really, really bad, right? Then that's the way they were just born. You can't do anything with that person. That's just the way they were born with their own set of genes. So how do you hold that person responsible under evolutionary thinking? I'm just fizzing differently than that person. You really can't come together. You can have a social contract, but the moment somebody decides to break that social contract, you can't even say they're wrong.
Right.
You just say, oh, that person's just fizzing differently. Okay, I really can't do anything about that. I don't have any real moral words to use for that because that's just the way they were born. So this one just fails on so many fronts that it honestly surprises me that so many people hold to this explanation. But again, I can kind of see it where I honestly just explain it this way, where people are comfortable insofar as on a surface level how much it explains that. Well, I guess I could see how a lot of people seem to be experiencing morality differently. Yeah, evolution kind of makes sense of that. But once you dig even just a foot deeper than that, you just open up this Pandora's box of all these sorts of problems that come with subjective morality and evolution as an explanation for it.
Yeah, just watch a season of Survivor. You
Nice.
see it all play out, right? You see people entering into these social contracts, right? But the minute it's broken, the minute someone betrays, the minute someone votes someone out when they said they wouldn't, these sorts of things, right? They're all outraged. And then when it comes time for the 3 people that might win the $1 million, right? And then there's the jury, they're always just kind of like, how dare you? You lied to me, you told me you were going to do this and you did that. You told me you were going to vote this way and you voted the other way and you voted me out, and you see the moral outrage. Well, why don't they just assume that, no one's going to abide by this social contract that we made in this alliance, Why would we expect them to?
I just wasn't smart enough. And
if
maybe
morality is just subjective, I can agree with the social contract one day, but if I turn around and break it the next day, why not? It's just the way my brain was working that day.
Yeah. So just to sum this one up, guys, is that if you have a person who's trying to offer this explanation that morality is just a trait that has evolved in humans, I would want to respond this way, and I would want to put a little pressure on them and say, well, what do you do with these people that if evolution is true, right? They're born with these murder genes or these predispositions to murder or to other vices, right? And other really immoral acts. What do you do with those people? And they'll probably try to say, well, they're going to be bad for the community as a whole. And you can just, again, push right back and say, well, why is it bad to go against the community? If evolution is just survival of the fittest, why is that bad? So you'll see that they're going to try to smuggle in morality at every chance they can, but you keep pushing back and say, you're assuming moral values in every explanation that you give, but you haven't answered, ultimately, where do moral values and duties come from? That's what we're trying to get at. So this one is a good one. A lot of people hold to it, and I'm surprised by that. But again, it just fails on the universality. If evolution is true, we shouldn't expect universality of moral values. And again, subjectivity just kills it all. So that leads us to then our last explanation here, which is morality is grounded in God and stems from God's nature. This is an explanation that has historically been the explanation from Judeo-Christian faith. And so let's talk a little bit about it. Does this satisfy those three characteristics about moral values and duties?
Well, we can't deny the universal nature of morality. As we've already discussed, anywhere you go, anywhere in the world, society is going to agree that abusing children is bad, it's immoral, that homicide, murder, immoral, stealing, immoral. These are the basic moral rules that you're going to find wherever you go. Wherever you go, there's going to be laws against stealing, against killing, against abusing the elderly, against abusing children, right? These are going to be laws that you find in every single society. Mm. So there's no doubt that the moral law is universal in nature. So how is it that we can have universal immaterial laws? And we know they're immaterial, as we've already discussed, because if it's just chemical reactions in the brain, if that's where morality is coming from, then it won't be universal either. So right. It's universal, therefore it must be immaterial. And then it comes down to the issue of where do we find morality, being embraced and expected and implemented, except with being, right? As we've talked about with the animal kingdom, you don't see animals demanding justice for those who break the code of conduct, right? Yeah. We don't see that. We don't see, judicial courts established by mice, that are going to attempt to hold cat kind accountable for all of the mice murders that have happened throughout the years, right?
I've heard of kangaroo courts. Is that a thing?
There are kangaroo courts, okay. But there's not real kangaroos in those courts.
Okay, I got to look that up again.
So, where do we find moral expectations? Where do we find, individuals attempting to hold people accountable for being immoral? Well, that happens, with human beings, right? And so you have, beings. There's no morality with this microphone. It's either on or it's off. It works good or it doesn't, but that's not a moral issue.
Yeah.
Right? There's not, any morality tied to, this drink. So where do we find, the exercise of morality and the expectation of morality and even the punishment of immorality, right? Well, we find that amongst human beings, right? So because it couldn't have evolved, because it's universal, and because it's immaterial, then there must be, and because it is law-like in nature, that there are duties and, values to it, well, then we ought to be looking for an immaterial being who is a lawgiver.
So who, meaning it's personal?
It's got to be a being, right? Because that's where we find morality implemented and embraced, is amongst beings. Mm-hmm. Therefore, there must be a being who gave us or created us with this moral law.
And that stands completely separate from us.
Because it's universal.
Right? And it's external.
Right.
Totally independent and external from us.
Yes.
We want it, as much as we try to point to each other and say, well, mine is better than yours, that kind of stuff. What we're really doing is just saying, I'm pointing to an external reference point, right?
Because of its universal nature, then the being who has implemented the moral law has to be beyond or greater than the universe. Mm-hmm. That's the only way you can have a universal law, is for there to be something greater than the universe.
Yeah, again, this is why it's one of my favorite topics to talk on is, I do use a similar response to that whenever I'm out there, when we're talking to the kids at UT campus and this conversation comes up. One of the examples that I like to point to is that it's similar to that, there's a meter stick, kind of like the original meter stick that was developed, and it's in Paris, it's in a museum. And that is the reference, the ultimate reference of, if you want to know how much meter is, they would point to that meter stick. That's the original meter stick. And if you come and show me, some board of length shorter or longer than a meter stick, I can tell you objectively that you're wrong, because I have the ultimate objective external reference point that I can point to and say, that is what a meter is. This is not a meter.
Are we talking about beef ribs?
Yes, we are, in fact.
Because meter stick sounds delicious.
Nice. Very nice. I see what you did there. But in the same way that God, because God is external, he's beyond his creation, unchanging, morality does not change from history. We experience it, we implement it differently, but that's different from, does morality change?
Right.
And it doesn't. And it's universal. So when I see an injustice happening, right, like murder, right, that's the big talk right now. When murder occurs, as a Christian, I am justified in saying, I can point to that act and say that is a violation of the standard that's been put upon us, external from us. Whereas an atheist or anybody that believes that subjective morality is the name of the game, they can only say that act is different from what I expected. I would not have done that, but I can't really call it objectively evil. The Christian really is the only person who's in a good position to say, I have an objective standard, an objective reference point to say whether you are in alignment with it or whether you are in violation of it. And so that's where, again, if we're judging by these three characteristics, universality, objectivity, and immaterial, it seems to me that Christianity, that God being the explanation, the source of morality, it stands true.
Yeah, with this recent issue of the officer who basically suffocated, a man who was under arrest, society's outraged, by this homicide, and rightly so. We ought to be outraged by every act of homicide, right? And the reason why is because there is a universal law that lets us know that we ought not murder one another, right? That speaks again of the universality of morality. If morality is subjective, or it's just something that has evolved and become part of us through evolution, right? All we could say to that is, I disagree with what that officer did, but I can't expect him to abide by my moral standards.
Exactly.
Right? There would be no case for outrage, right? There would be no way for us to say that was an act of injustice and inequality and he must be punished. All we could say is, I disagree. But then there's no basis to be able to say that he should have done something different. He should have allowed the man to breathe. He should have allowed the man some space. He should have been, kinder. He should have been, where would we get a basis for expecting someone else to embrace our code of conduct? Because again, even if he subscribed to the social contract of, our moral standard, what's to say he can't just change his mind tomorrow just because the neurons were firing differently?
Yep.
Right? The matter in motion just changed gears that day, and he did something different.
Yep.
Right? So because, our society is so outraged by this act, it just goes to show that what he did was wrong. We expect him to be punished because there is a universal law that God has given us that helps us to know that homicide is wrong, that murder is wrong and should be punished. Yeah. So the outrage is justified because there is a universal law.
Exactly. That's kind of going on that similar path is when we use words like injustice inequality. Those are morally loaded terms, right?
You bet.
But understand, internet audience, understand the implications when we use words like this, moral terms like that. When we use the words, say, like injustice, we're implying that there is such a thing as the standard of justice. We're implying that I know what perfect justice looks like, and that's not it. So we already have this picture in our mind somehow. Where did it come from? That's what we're trying to answer. That there's this perfect picture of justice and equality and happiness and goodness. And when we see violations of that, we're rightfully outraged. It reminds me of another really good passage it's from C.S. Lewis. In his book, Mere Christianity, he starts off by talking about how one day he was walking and somebody basically offended him in some way. And that just started him on this line of thinking of, well, where did I even get this idea of offense? And he started taking that a little further, and he says, how can I know that a line is crooked unless I know what a straight line looks like? And that's exactly parallel to what we're talking about here. How do I know what injustice looks like unless I know what the actual standard of justice is? And those are the types of questions that God is, as the standard bearer, as his nature is the standard to which we look to and try to live our lives by. That's what makes sense. Evolution as an explanation doesn't make sense. Subjective reasoning and just getting your moral values from your community or from your parents passed down, it is subjective, and it dies it's dead on arrival. It cannot answer these tough questions about what exactly is true justice, what is equality. There's no external standard to point to. You're just pointing to yourself, and that can change from day to day. So can the community. But when you have God as the external reference point, unchanging, eternal, external, objective, that explains every characteristic that we're talking about.
Bet.
And so, you brought up a really good point about, so God is the explanation. So this is one thing that just kind of bothers me about when you're trying to have a discussion about morality, especially with a person who is not a believer, who's not a Christian, who believes either in evolution or just subjective morality in general. It's hard to really get across that you're talking about you need an objective external reference point, right? Because, as a Christian, we believe we're all made in the image of God. And so when I believe that the person that I'm talking to is made in the image of God, I know that God has placed his moral law on their heart. And so I know that they're basically borrowing from my worldview, Christianity, and they're trying to live their lives out consistently, but it's just not working out. And so it's really hard when there's a confusion there. They have this inherent understanding of morality because they're made in the image of God, and yet they're trying to buck against it and trying to live their lives in a different manner, but they always keep coming back to there are actually evil things and good things that I must be living my life by, and others need to live their lives by it too. And so there's a confusion that happens at that point. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that I have trouble explaining when I'm getting into these conversations, and I'm sure many of you out there do too. But maybe just kind of segueing a little bit into, so I think we've set up a good explanation for why God is the best source or the source for morality, moral values and duties. But now as Christians, we talk about, okay, does the Bible have anything to say about this? Is there any biblical support to show that God is the source, moral values and duties?
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah, I figured. So, sorry,
actually, yeah, there's a lot. There's a whole lot. From Genesis to Revelation, we find God defining out, moral expectations, moral, values, moral duties, and as you've already pointed out, God claims that He has written His law upon our hearts. Right, we find that in Romans chapter 2, and of course that falls on the heels of Romans chapter 1. And in Romans chapter 1, we find, God breaking down the concept that we are without excuse because what may be known of God is manifest in us, for God has shown it to us. Right, so it's not just that the Bible defines morality, but God has actually placed the moral law upon our hearts, and then has given us a conscience that bears witness of the law. That's why people feel guilty when they do something wrong. There's a conscience that bears witness when we break the moral law written on our hearts. And that happens for people everywhere, regardless of whether they have a Bible on the shelf or not. Right? So, we can just separate out the Bible for a moment and just say that in the Bible, we learn that everyone that is born on this earth, every single person, has the moral law in their heart. So, there is a theory that people are born, tabula rasa, which is a blank slate, and then, people through experience gain information, and that leads itself, to the belief that, parents are the ones who pass on morality to their kids, right? So from creation, or from the birth, I should say, until, they receive the morality of their parents, it's, there is just like this existential development of personhood and what they're going to believe, right? But that's false. Biblically speaking, we are not born as a blank slate. We have innate information, which includes laws of logic, which develop, as we grow. They just naturally grow within the individual, right? And laws of morality as well. Both of these sets of immaterial laws help us to understand who God is and, how we ought to behave, right? So Paul confirms this in Romans chapter 2. He talks about the Gentiles who don't have the law, speaking of, the Old Testament, by nature do the things in the law. So there's a nature that we have that God has given us, and it leads us to aim at a life that would naturally line up with the Old Testament law, the Ten Commandments, right? So he says that the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law. These, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or also excusing them. So what Paul is saying there is that God has made us to know his law, even if we don't have the Bible. He's made us to know our guilt. And that's why Isaiah 1:18, God says, come now, let's reason together. Let's be reasonable.
Yeah.
Let's reason this out. And then what does he say next? Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as wool. So in other words, through Isaiah, God is saying a proper use of reasoning will help you to see that you're a sinner, that you've broken the moral law of God, and that by faith in him, those sins can be cleansed so that the stain of our sin is then turned white as snow by faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing that the Bible is really just giving us that information. And that's why, I teach the youth here, right? And I always encourage them to really just get a clear picture of what God is wanting you to do with your life, and you understand the characteristics of God. He's given us an open book test. Yeah. When you read through the book that he has given us and that has stood the test of time throughout all of history and has transformed so many lives, we see here a clear understanding that God has made us in his image, and we are born with that understanding, the basic understanding of morality, and it stems from his nature, right? Another verse that I like is basically pointing to the God as the standard of righteousness is Job 4:17, where the question is asked, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? Another one in Genesis 18, when this is Abraham entreating God for Lot and just trying to see if he can save some people there. But he asks this of God, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Shall not the judge of the earth do right? His implicit understanding is that there is a God, and it makes sense that if this is the God of the universe, then he has to be completely righteous, and he should make moral judgments that are perfect. That is his basic understanding of, if there is a God that exists, that is worthy of worship, then this God must be all righteous. He is the standard of righteousness, and that is the God that we Christians, that we worship, that has been revealed to us through the Bible. And there are plenty of other verses, guys, other passages that do point to the righteousness of God. but also the fact that the law has been written on our hearts and that we must live with this. Number one, this moral failing, we're born with that. There's no blank slate that we're born with, but we're already born in debt. We're born with this sin nature that we have to ask for forgiveness from God for. But that doesn't negate the fact that God is our standard of righteousness. He is the standard that we point to when we recognize certain things are good and bad, right and wrong. So out of all the different explanations that we've offered today that seem to be very popular these days, number one, that morality comes from your parents or your community, or that morality is just a trait that has evolved in humans. These fall deathly short, extremely short of offering a good explanation from where morality ultimately comes from. What we understand when we consider morality is that it's universal, it's objective, and it's immaterial. And when you look at Christianity and the explanation that is offered there, that God is eternal, he's external, he's objective, he's infinite, he's righteous, and he has created us with that inherent moral understanding. It's the law written on our hearts. You will understand that Christianity offers the best explanation, that God is the standard bearer. So hopefully that communicates across well to you guys on the internet. Hopefully we were able to break it down for you in a nice way. If you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear from you on the live chat. I think we'll jump into that right now. I think I got a question waiting for us in the queue. Let's see. We got a question from Facebook. It says,
Facebook is asking us a question?
Yeah, or is it MySpace? I can't. No, that's Facebook.
MySpace.
It's from 2003. And I'm kidding. Question from Facebook says, so what about people who think morality comes from community? So it is universal for their community, but subjective for others. So they can't interfere with another culture unless it affects them personally or their community. How would you respond to an objection like that, or just a question that dealing with morality in that way?
Well, answering questions is always tough because, I would want to ask them a few questions about what they mean by some things. So I
assume the worst. That's what I've always figured.
Just assume the worst about this. Yeah. So I think there's some confusion in terms.
Sure.
The question, as far as I understand it, it's kind of based around a misconception about what universal means, right? So if morality is universal, then another society somewhere else that has a different set of moral values would just be wrong. This was what we saw with Nazi Germany, right? They had a code of conduct and a set of moral values that were in conflict with what we recognize to be the universal moral law. How do we know this? Well, because they were exterminating Jews, right, who are human beings who deserve to live their lives, right? So in that situation, we recognize that there is a universal moral law, that the Third Reich was breaking the law in just the most horrific way, and they needed to be stopped. And so, we got together, and fought against that and brought it to an end. And we're justified in imposing universal moral laws upon people who attempted to have their own subjective moral laws. So is that...
Yeah, I like your interpretation of it. Now, how about if we take a twist? This is something that I've heard also is basically you can have your morals as long as it doesn't affect me personally.
Yep.
How would you go about kind of settling that conflict?
Well, the person who would say that is attempting to impose their morality on me.
Boom. So explain how that happens.
Sure.
How is it that they're imposing?
So it's like the person who says, you shouldn't evangelize people. It's wrong to evangelize people and try to get them to believe in your, story, your religious position, right?
Sure.
Now, that's their religious point of view. That's their belief,
Yeah.
right? So
And what
now,
are they doing with it?
So
Yeah.
now we're at an impasse because they believe evangelism is wrong. I believe evangelism is right. So who can actually live out, their point of view, right? Yeah. The person who believes that evangelism is wrong and then proceeds to evangelize that message by convincing people who evangelize that it's wrong to evangelize, they're actually breaking their own code of conduct.
Exactly.
Right? So the person who thinks that evangelism is wrong should just remain silent.
Yep.
And not try to pass that point of view off to others. Because there are others who believe that evangelism is right and that we've actually been called to do it. Right? So when I go out and evangelize, it's because Jesus told me to. Right? Matthew chapter 28. We've been given the Great Commission, right? So the person who would tell me that it's wrong to do that is actually guilty of breaking their own code of conduct by trying to convince me to side with their religious point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically self-defeating.
Yeah.
Right? The moment, they're basically guilty of what they're accusing you of doing, right? But the issue is that Bunjee is the one that he's living his life out consistently, whereas the moral relativist is self-defeating because he says, I don't want to impose my morality on others, and I'm going to let you know by imposing it on you, right?
Yeah, I don't believe that anybody should impose their morality on anybody else, and so I don't want to see you imposing your morality on me. Wait a minute. You just defeated your whole point of view.
Plus, I would ask that person, well, okay, if you were being mugged, right, at gunpoint, or if you saw somebody else getting mugged, right, would you try to impose your morality that you believe that that person has dignity and worth? Would you go try to save that person? Or would you say, but I got this conflict. I can't impose my morality. I think it's wrong. I have a preference that says I would rather not do that, but I don't want to impose my morality on that person, so I'm just going to watch, right? Or I'm just going to turn away. People actually go to jail for that, for being in a position to help and actually failing to do so, right?
Isn't that the way Seinfeld ended?
Yeah. Yes. I was just thinking on that today for some reason.
Yeah.
Anyways, very good question. Hopefully we answered it. If you need any clarification, let us know in the live chat or on the Facebook. Let us know. I got another objection here that people ask. So let's see. Yes, so many people disagree. So relativism must be true. I think we touched on this a little bit, but let's hash this one out. So many people disagree.
So moral relativism is the idea that, your morality is good for you, my morality is good for me. We can't, believe that there's some universal morality. And so whatever you think is moral is fine for you. Whatever I think is moral is fine for me. Let's not, try to impose that on one another type of thing. So the question is that, well, because so many different people disagree, about the moral law and have different or variations of moral law, then moral law must not be universal, and therefore it must be, at the end of the day,
relative.
Must fall under the heading of relativism. There's a couple different ways to address that, right? I mean, we had discussed earlier about, those basic moral truths that are found in every civilization anywhere you go. Even like, in groups of cannibals.
Yeah, even the cannibals.
Even the cannibals abide by a moral code of conduct. It's wrong for those in a cannibalistic society to eat one another in their society.
Were you once a cannibal?
Well,
is that what it?
No,
okay.
I've never been a cannibal. I didn't even listen to that band that was, what was it called? They Might Be Cannibals or something.
Nice.
So, fine young cannibals. Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I was blending They Might Be Giants with
there you go.
Fine young cannibals.
Too obscure for me.
So, even within a cannibalistic society, it's wrong for the group to murder their own people and eat their own people, right? They eat people outside of their community, right?
Because they view them differently.
Because they're different, right? Yeah. Those are animals out there. This is civilization, right? So we could make the argument that, well, just look at the baseline morality that you see in every society. It's wrong to abuse kids. It's wrong to commit homicide. There's basic, some civilizations, if you get caught stealing, they cut your hand off, right? I mean, that's, you find, laws against thievery and these sorts of things in every basic society. So that's one way to address this. And another way to look at this is to understand the difference between morality ontologically versus epistemologically. You want to open that one up?
Yeah, ontology versus epistemology.
Yes.
Very long words that I would be able to spell correctly. Bunjee wouldn't. But either way, ontology is dealing with the essence of things. And the way I say essence, the nature of things. What is the actual ontology of something? What is the nature of something? So when we're talking about morality, what is it about morality, and what can we deduce from those characteristics? That's ontology, the essence of things. Epistemology is how we come to know about certain things. And that's where, so that's, the explanation offered about how people gather their morals from their parents or from their community. That is an example of how somebody comes to know certain moral values, but it doesn't explain anything about the essence of those moral values.
Right.
That is the distinction that I feel the majority of people that I speak with, at least, about morality, they trip up on this. And that's where they come up with faulty explanations, because they're merely looking at the idea that, well, everybody seems to disagree with moral values, therefore I'm drawing conclusions about the essence of moral values, and
Right.
That's not the way to do it.
Ontologically speaking, there is actual morality. There is a perfect law of morality that God has given us. Epistemologically, we're trying to understand what that is.
Yeah.
Right? And we oftentimes fail. So in these failures to epistemologically understand the ontological nature of morality, people will point at these epistemological failures and say, oh, see,
Yeah.
there must not be an actual logic because we struggle to understand it or struggle to implement it, right? They pull the same trick with logic,
Yep.
right? It's like, no. We're all trying to make sense of something that actually exists.
Mm-hmm.
There is actual morality. There is a universal law. And epistemologically, we're trying to make sense of it and understand it and apply it. And we fail. But that doesn't, our failures and our inconsistencies and inabilities to fully implement the moral law is not an accusation against the moral law. It's an accusation against us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that will help you in conversation. So when somebody's trying to bring up this idea that, well, everybody disagrees on what is right, what is wrong. So how can we say that morality is objective, or morality is actually something that exists, right? Then you can push back and on this distinction between ontology and epistemology. What is actually the case versus how do we live that out? How do we understand that?
Another way to go about it, though, which is my favorite way, is that when somebody insists that, well, we can't really know what's morally correct because so many different people have so many different opinions, the best way to deal with that is you just punch them right in the face and then ask them, was that wrong?
After they stop bleeding and after they wake up.
Was that morally wrong? And is that universally true? Like, if we go anywhere in the universe, can I not punch you there too?
Yeah, this is why I'm not showing you this side of my face, guys. I can't smile correctly anymore.
Don't punch people in the face.
Don't punch people in the face, guys.
Joking.
Please. All right.
Kick him in the shin. Doesn't leave as big as a mark.
Very nice. All right, let's look at another objection that people will bring up here in these last remaining minutes. Yes, this is a popular conversation stopper, and people just say, "Well, that's just your opinion." This is I can't tell you how many times I've come across this where people are willing to engage with you for a certain amount of time, and they push back, they offer some good objections, and you're answering them. And then I think, once a person becomes flustered, or maybe they run out of explanations, or maybe they just feel like they're trapped or something, they end the conversation. Well, that's just your opinion. How do we answer this? And here's where the way I would answer this is, number one, is that opinions can be right or wrong. Okay? Sure, that is my opinion, but that's not the question at hand. The question at hand is whether my opinion is correct or incorrect. So let's dig a little bit further. Okay? So that would be one quick, pithy way of just answering that. But personally, I like to take the approach and just challenge the person when I see that they're getting flustered or they're just not really understanding what I'm throwing at them or something like that. I would just challenge them to, with certain practical examples about how, logically speaking, if morality is relative or subjective, how is that going to play out? And just ask them to really chew on that, dwell on that, and say, you know this is the case. This is the case. This is how morality would be if it were subjective or relative. And does this ring true to you? Or does it make more sense that it's objective? And then you have to ask yourself that question, what's the source of that? Right? Those are the ways that I usually approach them. Maybe you have a different way. If somebody's just trying to stop the conversation.
I would just say that's your opinion.
Well, that's just your opinion.
Yeah, you know, I think that the point of engaging people in conversation is to help them to, you know, rethink their point of view or to consider that they might be wrong. And, you know, the person that would come to that place where they're ready to just shut down a conversation by just saying, well, that's just your opinion, you know, I'm good. I'm good that that's the end of the conversation, you know.
Yeah.
Personally, I just, you know, because I'm not going out to argue with people just to argue with people, and I'm not out there just to waste my time to try to, you know, notch my belt with, you know, apologetic victories, you know. And the person that's just going to shut me down with, well, that's just your opinion. All right.
Yep.
You're right. That's my opinion.
I bid you adieu, sir.
I said good day.
I said good day.
So, yeah, I'm not interested in trying to, you know, force a continuing conversation with someone that has probably ducked out at some point in time along the way. Chances are I've already given them a lot to think about. And so I might just conclude by just saying, well, that is my opinion. And I hope you go home and you think about some of the things that we've talked about. You know, inevitably they will, you know, because the minute somebody is forced to face a logical, reasonable point of view that they didn't have a good defense against, their brain's going to have to just deal with that.
Yeah.
You know, I remember, you know, when I was given, the gospel message with apologetic arguments, and my brain really wrestled, you know, with that information and attempted to try to figure out how to just dismiss it, and I couldn't, right? Yeah. You know, so someone who's at that point, you know, they're crying uncle. They're calling for mercy at that point in time. They don't have an argument. They've probably already been, you know, challenged enough. And so I'll just, that's my opinion.
What I heard is that your very presence is just a lot to take in. So at some point they just give up, cry uncle.
That's your opinion.
I get it. Yeah. Very nice. I want to take a little break here, and I want to just say we're going to continue on for just a couple more questions, but what I do want to do is say goodbye to the people accessing through cable access channel 11. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope if you guys want to continue the conversation, we're still on YouTube Live and Facebook Live. Go to youtube.com/Calvary South Austin. Jump in on the discussion there. We're still going to go for a few more minutes here, but thank you for tuning in.